Ken Wallach, Chairman of the Board of the National Endowment for Democracy. For those who are here in person and the many people who are here online, thank you for joining us to learn more about the late Oswaldo Payá and the remarkable book by David Hoffman, who chronicles Payá's lifelong struggle to initiate a peaceful democratic transition in Cuba. For those of you using social media, please join the conversation online and tag at NE Democracy. Having served at the National Democratic Institute for more than 3 decades before my retirement in 2018, I, along with the entire NED family, was fortunate to witness political transitions, some more than successful than others. We were proud to have supported the courageous efforts of democratic icons, Havel, Mandela, Kim Dae-jung, Tutu, Johnson, Sirleaf, to name but a few. Before reading David's Give Me Liberty, I thought I knew most everything about Oswaldo Payá. Perhaps a lesser known to some, but no less courageous, consequential, or iconic. After all, Payá was the recipient of NDI's 2002 Democracy Award. We had produced a documentary about him that was shown at our awards ceremony and at the 2003 Tribeca Film Festival. It was portrayed in the press at the time as the alternative to Oliver Stone's Comandante, which HBO wisely asked Tribeca to pull from the festival at the very last minute. I had visited Oswaldo in Havana 2 years later, and I was able to spend time with his Varela Project volunteers and his extraordinary family, Ophelia, who is with us today, Oswaldo Jr., Ronaldo, and Rosa Maria, who will speak to and who continues her father's mission. I was joined on the trip by Genaro Arriagada, who coordinated the campaign that defeated General Pinochet in the 1988 presidential plebiscite. It was the No campaign that had inspired the Varela Project, and Oswaldo wanted to look at Genaro, his Christian Democratic counterpart. But reading David's painstakingly researched portrait of Payá and the Castro regime, there was so much more to learn. A deeply religious man who, from a very young age, set out on a path to change history. First Cuban dissident to build a nationwide crusade for democracy. His campaign was improbable. Some would say quixotic, given how an omnipresent regime orchestrated its repression with the techniques honed by the East German Stasi. But Payá, with his faith, along with his patience, humility, kindness, and quiet demeanor, all of which masked sheer tenacity, created a grassroots campaign larger than himself. His persistence and yetness when it came to principles made the church hierarchy uneasy, undoubtedly led the regime to understand that his leadership and his movement were a genuine threat to its hold on power. Payá was fearless, even in the face of constant threats to his life. And through the Varela Project and the subsequent national dialogue which he led, he wanted to break the fear that gripped so many others. But he was not driven by anger or a desire for revenge. Rather, he preached dialogue and reconciliation. The regime first tried to quash the Varela Project by formally rejecting the goals of the campaign, then by arresting volunteers and what became known as the Black Spring. From all credible accounts, by killing Payá 10 years ago this month, along with Harold Cepero, Oswaldo's friend and close associate. Payá had welcomed international solidarity, but he was a Cuban patriot and fiercely independent. He believed deeply in the resilience and capacity of the Cuban people to demand and secure their own freedom. I remember vividly his visit to Washington in 2003, the last time the regime allowed him to leave the country, although he was given the opportunity to go into exile, which he refused. On the evening of his arrival in DC, he asked me what advice I could offer his hectic schedule of meetings and speeches. I said, please be prepared. The first question he asked is whether he supported or opposed the US embargo. Many in Washington, I said, will want to condense your life into one issue. This was his reply. There are those who will tell you that the embargo will eventually lead to a free Cuba. I am here to tell you that after 40 years, the embargo is not bringing democracy to my country. Some will argue that lifting the embargo will bring democratic change. But lifting the embargo, he asserted, is not the answer to our struggle. What these two arguments have in common, however, is the belief that change in Cuba will come through Washington. I am here to tell you that change will come from the Cuban people. Obviously, Payá was in no need of advice. Give Me Liberty captures all of this and much, much more. How David was able to research and uncover so much about Payá and the regime he bravely challenged is a mystery. But through David's work, the world will now have the opportunity to know the life and legacy of what the Cuban blogger Leone Sanchez has called a faultless man. And when we read about the growing number of democratic campaigns that have emerged since Payá's death, know that they all can trace their origins to Payá's Varela project. In addition to the NDI Democracy Award, Oswaldo was given the prestigious Sakharov Prize by the European Parliament. He deserved to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, for which he was nominated by his friend, Václav Havel. And that friendship is another story in and of itself. But more important than awards and prizes, Oswaldo Payá should have lived to lead his country's democratic transition. Cuba, the hemisphere, and the world would have been a much better place. It now gives me great pleasure to turn him over to Carl Gershman, the former and founding president of the National Endowment for Democracy. Carl.
Thank you, Ken. That was great. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for coming. Over the years, the NED has worked with and supported a number of great leaders in the struggle for democracy and has held memorial meetings honoring some of them who gave their lives in defense of freedom. I'm thinking of brave individuals like the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, the Chinese Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo. Yesterday, we observed the actual 5th anniversary of his death in a Chinese prison. The Tibetan monk Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, and Laura Payan, the leader of the Damas de Blanco in Cuba. Remembering the courage and the commitment of such people, and there are others, and being touched by their spirit has shaped the political identity of the NED and sharpened its moral focus. Oswaldo Payá was such an individual, and that is how we remember him today as we approach the 10th anniversary of his death, that, as we all know, and that, as Ken mentioned, was not the result of some accident, but was the result of a deliberate and premeditated act by the government of Cuba. No one can bring Payá back, but David Hoffman has told the story of his life in a way that captures Payá's humility and his humane character, his integrity, his capacity for leadership and strategic. and his extraordinary dedication to the struggle for a free Cuba. Only someone with the courage and conviction and perseverance of Oswaldo Payá could have fought for so long against a dictatorship like the one in Cuba that was so logically absolutist and politically arrogant, and he never lost hope. David makes clear for all of us to see that Payá was a great man, like Václav Havel, his friend, as Ken mentioned, who will be remembered long after the founders of Cuba's despotism and its current leaders have taken their rightful place in the dustbin of history. His funeral 10 years, Cardinal Jaime Ortega eulogized him as a man of faith on a political mission. That was not quite true. He was a man of faith on a mission of faith, who never compromised his belief that the rights of all human beings were never compromised, were a gift from God and couldn't be given or taken away by any government, however despotic. It's true, though, that Payá did have a political mission, which was to end the lies, the fear, the doctrines, as the anthem Patria y Vida says, and replace them with truth, with dignity, and with a new dawn. Because he pursued this mission with a consistent moral purpose, Payá laid the foundation for what will someday be a democratic Cuba. And I am sure that that will happen someday. Our meeting today is very, very important. To be together, to celebrate David's book and Payá's life, and to be joined by Ofelia Acevedo, Payá's wife and his perfect soulmate, which is how one of Payá's friends described her in Give Me Liberty. And it's also wonderful to have the children here, Oswaldito, Rinaldo, and of course, Rosa Maria. Our program today will be a conversation that NED President Damon Wilson will moderate with David and with Rosa Maria, who is carrying on her father's work with steadily growing stature. And I know how proud he would be of her. Now my honor to invite them all to take their seats on the platform. And before the program begins, we'll see a brief video about Oswaldo Payá that will be narrated by David. Thank you.
His name was Oswaldo Payá, one man up against the totalitarian system. He was born into a prosperous Catholic family. He was nearly 7 years old when Fidel Castro came to power. Payá held the fundamental belief that the rights of every person are bestowed by God.
El mismo que nos ataca a nosotros.
But every day in Cuba, he saw those rights were trampled upon. He never lived in a free Cuba, but it lived in his mind, and it drove him.
Hay una voz que no se puede callar, que es la voz del pueblo.
Payá wasn't in a violent revolution. He fought with words. He knew that Cuba's constitution, even under Castro, allowed its citizens the right to ask for change. His most daring challenge to Castro was a citizen petition, the Varela Project.
a un gobierno que los podía reprimir y que ya no está reprimiendo. Decimos, los cubanos tenemos derecho a los derechos.
He needed at least 10,000 signatures for a legislative initiative. And he got them. The rest of the world took notice. But demanding democracy in Cuba was dangerous for those who dared to challenge Castro. Eventually, Fidel had had enough.
Patria o muerte, venceremos.
In a 3-day period, over 75 people were arrested,
Pero que es horrible que tú hayas estado 6 años preso injustamente.
including the inner circle of the Varela Project. But Oswaldo Payá refused to give up. And now he was a marked man.
That is fantastic. So first of all, Ken, Carl, thank you for kicking us off so well. Really consequential piece of work, David. Congratulations. What a remarkable book. And it is quite a special day here at the Endowment. You've heard of the tradition from Ken and Carl of Oswaldo Payá, idea of a free Cuba here in the Endowment. But to have this event with you, Rosa Maria, with the presence of your mother, Ophelia, your family, it's quite special. I've been in the role here for just 1 year. And this is special for me because when I was taking over, Carl called me early on and he said, look, he talked to me about Oswaldo Payá. And he said, I want you to sit down and talk to Rosa Maria to feel the story. And it was one of the meetings I did before I came here a year ago. We met at the Tabard Inn and began a very important conversation for me, so that on my first day at the Endowment, July 26, almost a year ago, I called Rosa Maria to underscore how the support, the Endowment support, their tradition, that Carl and Ken had so invested in the Endowment's commitment, the work that Barbara and others have been involved in, would remain a top priority for us here at the Endowment. I called her as I think you were out protesting in the White House with placards in Lafayette Square. And we're doing this at a consequential moment. This book has come out between July 11th, the 1-year anniversary of the protests that began in Cuba last year, and July 22nd, the painful anniversary of the fatal crash in which your father died. And so I want to start with David on this. But David, I mean, you're a remarkable journalist. You were in Jerusalem and Moscow. You've covered the White House. You've done remarkable books on the arms race, espionage, oligarchs. Why Cuba? Why Payá? Why did you write this book?
Thank you all for being here, and thanks to Ned for this really remarkable day. And it's just filled with meaning for me also to be able to talk about this story with all of you. My time in Russia had led me to report some on Andrei Sakharov. And on one particular trip, I went to the house in the woods where he wrote his famous essay. And my Russian friend said, you know, there were millions and millions of people who saw the cruelty and the depravity of Soviet communism, who felt the things that Sakharov felt, but only one Sakharov who stood up for them. And I wondered often, what was it that a single individual would be driven to step up to something as implacable and as a totalitarian system like the Soviet Union? Andrei Sakharov was part of the elite. He had helped design the hydrogen bomb. You would have thought would have been part of a passive approach, and instead he posed the most fundamental challenge. Oswaldo Payá, I saw that kernel, that uniqueness of somebody standing up against that implacable wall. And that always seemed to me to be a story that needed to be told, and it hadn't been told. So that's why when this book appeared as a possible story, I went for it. I could see what it meant.
So Maria, maybe you can add to this to help us understand who was your father? Why him? Why did he emerge with the courage, the creativity to play this role?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Carl, Ken, General Secretary, and all the friends that are here with us today. Many of you met my father, and many of you are inspired by him, even when you never got to meet him. I think that question is one of the lines that David answered during the whole book. What is the motivation of my father to confront that wall, to stoop in front of such a terrible and immense power and I can only answer with my experience of him. I do agree with Carl and with David. Always led by his faith. He was always led by, at the end of the day, his love for his prójimo, his brothers and sisters. And he found that those brothers and sisters are the Cuban people. He had a great understanding of the Cuban people. I only aspire to have a portion of that. And he believed in people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's key. I think that's fundamental. And I think that Ken also touched on the fact that my father identified the Cuban solution that the people, in which the people was going to be the protagonist of the story. It's not a phrase. It's not a slogan. It's something that he actually lived and worked for and achieved in many sense. When you realize that in a moment in which having a cell phone was a crime in Cuba, there were hundreds of Cubans collecting names, signatures, ID numbers, address of tens of thousands of Cubans that were telling to Fidel Castro and the whole regime, we want our rights. You realize about the power that resides in that people. And I think that my father was capable of seeing that even when that people, in many cases, the rest of the world, and for sure the regime, have been telling, there is nothing you can do. We're going to be here forever. We're going to crush you if you stand up. We're going to crush you if you raise your voice. Even under those conditions, and even after that propaganda and that fear, that culture of fear and simulation, even in the midst of all, my father was able to see the real power and where the real was.
Maria, what does this mean to you as his daughter? What's the significance to you, to your way, to have this story told this way now?
It is a dream come true. Dream come true. Ken told us something a few minutes ago. For us, for a long time overdue. We have it as a personal debt, not something that else should do. That's why we are so grateful with Dave and with Carol that had a very important in having this book now in the 10th anniversary of the assassination. It's for us it's crucial to be able to not only keep alive the legacy of my father, but being able to transmit that legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And David just did it beautifully. I learned things about my father that I didn't know reading David.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. A man who, one of 7 children, 3 years of hard labor. Both of you have mentioned his faith. It figures prominently in the story. Excuse me, David, you capture how the Catholic Church had the power to turn out 1 million people on the streets of Havana, which really shocked Fidel. You capture how before a country that's gone from 1 priest for almost over 8,000 people to, in the 1980s, 1 per 45,000, how nuns wiped out across the island. Talk a little bit about how was faith central to Oswaldo Payá's movement in a time when there was strength in faith, but really quite a tension with the church.
You know, Oswaldo was a pragmatic fellow, and I oftentimes think of him as a philosopher who learned his philosophy on the street. And when he was born just 10 days before Batista took power in a coup, and he was about 7 years old when Fidel came to power, he lived his whole life in a dictatorship. And the lessons of that were quite clear, even as a young man. You know, he could see that after 4 generations of his family worshiped at local church, he could see that people were persecuted. Stones were thrown to them on their way to church. The church was defaced. Christians marginalized by the revolution. When he was 13, his father's business was seized while he stood there. The militia came in, they took Alejo off to jail. He protested the Soviet crushing of the Prague Spring when he was in high school. After that, he was sent away to the UMA forced labor camps. So the first thing I would say is, what kind of faith do you have when you've spent your life in this cauldron of denial and dictatorship? But there was a place where Oswaldo felt, and he was very fortunate and I think thankful that a priest at El Salvador del Mundo, the local church, Father Alfredo Petit, had encouraged youth to regard the church and faith as a temple of freedom. And in the church, he said, you can have discussions and you can talk about anything. And that was certainly far than what Oswaldo had on the street. And this open conversation led him to hope that his faith would lead in that direction. You see, as he grew a little bit older, he saw the adults in the church after Mass gathering in the foyer of the church. And that's where they would have open discussions. They'd talk about radio broadcasts they had heard from abroad or a book that had been smuggled in. And he thought, then faith must be a place where I have space. Later, he organized a club of free thinking within the church. And Felix Varela, the iconic educator and priest of Cuban history, was the first subject of that. So as he matured and after he came back from the labor camps and was looking for his place in the world. He thought in the 1980s, maybe the church will be the way I can find freedom. And he was disappointed because the hierarchy of the church was very badly persecuted and really almost destroyed by the Castro Revolution. Many priests had been forced out. People who were believers had to struggle to hold on to their faith. There's a story in the book, a young parishioner who was to grab a ream of paper from the workplace and bring it so the church would have at least some paper to print something on. And the priest, of course, blessed the paper, even though it was stolen, because they had so little. Oswaldo began working for Jaime Ortega as the Bishop of Havana on a major re-examination of the church's place, something that had grown out of this terrible state it was in. Oswaldo went with Jaime around the country. He heard people, a great outpouring before of complaints about what had happened to Catholics in these years. So there was this restlessness. He saw it. And finally, when the big conference took place and was to be a reflection on where would the church go, Oswaldo wanted to give a speech, which he and Ophelia had written, and it was titled Faith and Justice. And it was a distillation of all the feeling he had gained from observing the street. And the church hierarchy asked him not to give it, because it would have been a real challenge to Castro. Oswaldo never left his church, but he didn't give the speech. And after this, he began to publish a smudgy little bulletin, sometimes only one page, run off on a mimeograph machine. Here, he began to, again, write these views, the search for truth, the idea of freedom. What is liberty? Why is it that people in Cuba to even say the name God, fearing some kind of punishment? He wrote this in an essay in one of the De Dios. This little newsletter was eagerly awaited at the church door around Havana, drive around in a car distributing this smudgy little thing. And then the Archbishop asked them to stop. They stopped for a little while, and then they couldn't help themselves. They started printing it again, typing it. It was a clandestine kind of samizdat thing. So Oswaldo, for this whole time, found in his faith an avenue or a pathway toward freedom. He found it even after the hierarchy of the Catholic Church decided they couldn't go there with him.
David has captured extraordinary stories, as Maria Rosa has noted. His effort to put up Feliz Navidad in town and the controversy around that. I'm going to say it several times through this, but if you haven't had a chance yet, you need to order the book. Simon & Schuster, your local bookstore, Amazon.com, whatever your preferred way. But there's so much granularity. You're getting a snippet of that. It's a must read. You mentioned Felix Varela, and we'll talk about the Varela project, but I don't want to start with there because that wasn't the starting point. This was not a linear path. It's a little bit about how you saw Oswaldo Paya's path to advocacy, lessons about how he was learning the practice of democracy before arriving at the petition drive.
So Oswaldo, again, was a product of this street. He was a product of experience, always learning. And he had this notion that people have a right to rights, and especially, he said, we have to be the protagonists of our own history and not the spectators. And this goal, this idea that takes things into your own hands, it sounds pretty noble and quite compelling, except that in Cuba, under those years, it was not possible. Although faced this long, difficult struggle to figure out how to do it. And I think that there's several really important turning points here. One is that the 1940 Constitution of Cuba had this provision that he was aware of even in the late 1980s. The 1940 Constitution of Cuba, product of a democratic republic, really the zenith of Cuba's democratic experience, allowed 10,000 citizens to sign a petition and ask for a law to be passed. It put the power of making laws in the hands of the people. Several people had tried this, to use this without success. And I want to mention that my friend Gustavo Alvarez, who's the grandson of Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote this Constitution, is with us today.
Welcome, welcome.
And this, so this idea was early in Oswaldo's mind, that you could ask people to become the protagonists of their own by collecting signatures. He started doing it very early in this process. He had collected signatures for a national dialogue. He was very much enamored of Lech Walesa and what he saw was solidarity in Poland. He actually thought maybe Cuba could be like Poland. It didn't quite work out like that, but one time collecting signatures, he had only a few hundred signatures on a little book, like a guest book signing in his house, and the regime created a mob to attack him in July of 1991. You saw the picture of it in the film. And they destroyed everything and turned over the signatures. So the message was, you can't do that here. He didn't give up. He thought after that, maybe he would try to sketch out a detailed plan of transition from Cuba was to democracy. As Ken and Carl, there was a huge discussion in those years of how do the nations of Eastern Europe make it. And Oswaldo wrote 46-page single-space plan. But this didn't work either. People were not ready to read the fine print. A lot. How do I mobilize people for my idea? And he kept trying with different things. He tried a group. He worked hard with this umbrella group called Concilio Cubano to, again, see if everybody together could mobilize people, and the regime destroyed it. They crushed it and stopped it. And finally, Waldo sat down and thought, what I need is not a 46-page plan. I don't need any more diagrams, but I need a little bit of a easy to understand approach. And he wrote it down 5 points. And these 5 points became the Varela Project. And the genius was he would take the law of the land, a provision that was still in the Cuban Constitution, that had been long overlooked, and turn it against the state. And he came up with the idea of a citizen petition for change, for a plebiscite and a referendum, that he could take to people and say, this is legal. This is in our Constitution. And that simplicity and the genius of taking this provision and turning it against the state began to click. He found the way to mobilize people, and it still took years. It took 4 years to get 10,000 signatures.
Rosa Maria, what is your recollection of understanding from your father of both the risk he was prepared to take, but also the learning, the struggling to figure out what would work, the tactics, as he settled on the petition drive?
He was just tireless. I remember to have seen my father many times tense, many times there were very difficult or hard discussions, or a lot of persecution, or our house was surrounded by the state security, or you could see him nervous because we were just going in and out of the house, the school, the life of a teenager in Cuba. I remember him struggling, talking with so many people, receiving so many people. I don't remember and have seen him defeated. he was a natural optimist, but at the same time he was very pragmatic as being able to create and organize a campaign that, in the midst of the culture of fear and simulation and the security persecution, was careful in collecting the signatures, actually tens of thousands of but this continued perception that it was possible, not only right, but possible.
So Rosa Maria, he's quoted as saying that he thought he could be, maybe even would be killed, but he didn't flee. You mentioned he even had an opportunity during the Mariel boat lift. Why do you think your father stayed?
I cannot imagine otherwise. We have talked a lot about the tension, about the persecution, the fear, the hard life that my father had. I say that it was also a happy life. Mm. And I think that happiness is not always joy. It's not always content. The base of that was that he was doing what he decided to do in each time. I mean, they were both in peace with their decisions, and they made a commitment with God, with themselves, with the Cuban people, that came also from a very basic human position, and is, I have the right to live in my country and be happy and pursue happiness in whatever the way I want. Fidel Castro cannot determine my life.
What a testament to your father to raise a happy family in a difficult time.
Could I add something to that?
Please, David.
In the Mariel boat lift was a moment where many Cubans came from Miami in their own boats to bring Cubans out, and Fidel had said, yes, if you want to leave, go to the port of Mariel. Oswaldo's family was large, and on his mother's side, most of his aunts and uncles had left. I think 7 or 8 of them had gone to, and so some of them rented boats and they came for him. And then they showed up and said, Oswaldo, we've come for you. And he said, I'm not leaving with you. And they were sort of slack-jawed and stunned. They'd come all this way and he wouldn't go. And he said, I'm not leaving. Fidel must leave.
Love it. David, let me come back to the Varela Project piece of this. You've talked a little bit about the impact of President Carter, his visit, of his comments. Say a little bit about that, combined with some who feared that this whole effort was implicit legitimacy of the regime itself, playing within Castro's rules. How did both President Carter's comments impact this, while others on the outside skeptical of the effort?
Oswaldo's project, the Varela Project, was the result of his long thought about what pathway you could use to get the change. Having seen the Tiananmen massacre, he was profoundly worried about bloodshed. He was committed to nonviolent change. Often, we cannot get to liberation through bloodshed. And he worried greatly after 1989. So when Jimmy Carter came to Cuba in 2002, And he was the first former president in a long time. Spoke at the University of Havana, and in his televised live remarks, told the Cuban people about the Varela Project, the citizen petition. Most of them had never heard of it. Most of them didn't know about it because Oswaldo had no avenue. He was not able to talk about this in the radio or on television or in the press. And of course, he was thrilled that Carter had broken the ice that way. And the Varela Project signatures, the first 11,020, had been submitted just days before Carter's arrival. So I think that Oswaldo's notion was that people, if they were shown the Varela Project, the 5 demands for freedom, a free press, freedom of association and belief, free enterprise, the ability to form a business, freedom for political prisoners, free elections. People didn't only just say, yeah, okay, I'm for it. I mean, we also here in the United States tend to take these petitions for granted as sort of a normal thing. This was extraordinary. This was a petition that went against everything the revolution stood for. People did not only put their names and their addresses, they put their identification numbers. And Oswaldo verified every one of them 3 times, in part because state security tried to destroy the project with fake signatures. So again, I think that this method ultimately turned out to be what Cubans have been trying for a long time. The Cuban Republic from 1902 to 1952 had numerous efforts in striving for democracy, sometimes successful. The years from 1940, when the Constitution was approved, to 1952, saw 3 transitions of power in Cuba that were peaceful and constitutional. The Castro Revolution is sometimes obliterated its history, but Cuba has a democratic history, and one that the 1940 Constitution symbolizes. And Oswaldo was essentially pulling on the thread that Constitution had set. I think that it's interesting question why Fidel didn't stop him, why Castro didn't see, and maybe he was taken by surprise a little bit. Maybe he thought Oswaldo Payá had only 100 or 200 signatures. But on that day in May 2002, Oswaldo marched to the National Assembly with a box with 1,020 signatures of people. And I think that that's a remarkable achievement. And it was the authors of 1940 Constitution and what people before that, I described some of their efforts in this book. There were generations of people who struggled for democracy in Cuba. They've been forgotten, some in the shadow of the revolution, but they deserve to be remembered.
I want a chance to be able to take a couple of questions from the audience, so please catch my eye. I'm going to come first to Rosa Maria, but if you want to weigh in, please, I will turn to the audience shortly. Rosa Maria, you have worked to continue the legacy of your father through your own work. And if you think about the situation today, how might it look different? This was before the age of technology, online access, even as difficult it is on the island. How do you think that this effort might look different today? Think about the task of mobilizing people today. What did we learn from July 11th last year?
Well, we learned that the Cuban people is ready for transition, is willing, and is the Cuban people are actually willing to risk and willing to take the highest possible risk, actually, which is their life, which is freedom, safety for them, for their families. There are more than 1,000 political prisoners in this moment.
Yeah.
Jose Daniel, one of the leaders of the Varela Project, one of the collectors of the Varela Project, now also a leader of Cuba Decide, has been in jail since then. It was missed for 35 days. And yesterday, his family was able to see him for 2 minutes. we also learn how big is the fear of the regime. A regime that is so weak, the thing that they have is violence. The thing that they have is repression. They have no proposal for the Cuban people, no answer to the most basic questions and demands of the Cuban people that are the same of the Varela Project and the same of the 80s. It's just, we have the right to have rights, as my father used to say. A few months, actually, almost a year before his assassination, my father wrote an article saying that the regime violated the legal demand of the Cuban people, the legal will of tens of thousands of Cubans that were demanding their rights through a referendum. The regime violated their own law to prevent those rights and that referendum from taking place. And of course, violated common sense when you get to the conclusion that the only thing that Fidel and now the regime or the family that is still in power have never, ever done is just to ask to the people. So that he said, okay, let's go directly to a plebiscite and ask the Cuban people if they want free, fair, and multi-party elections. He actually said, we could pick another question. At the end of the day, question for the system. Do you want democracy or not? And of course, it's a tool. It's a tool to being able to do it in an organized way. Because we have the right to democracy, period. But that tool is very important because, and it's again, one of the fundamental lines of my father, one of the pillars. There is no change without the Cuban people. Everybody should be invited to be part of that change. I also learned that we need the support of the international community. It is essential, the citizen mobilization, and I think that we are. The movement is actually aimed to promote that plebiscite, but with the strategy of the struggle and the mobilization of the citizens and the diaspora require the support of the international community, because that regime, with its power, all its resources, is willing to shoot down the people on the streets.
Let me just, in the minutes that remain, I want to turn to our audience and a couple of questions. Zach will bring forward a microphone. Take this, our colleague here in the front, and this one here, we'll take these two together, please. Please introduce yourself, ask a question, address our colleagues.
Hi. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I am halfway through the book. It's written beautifully. Thank you so much for your courage. Gusto en conocerla. And thank you for holding this forum. I'm wondering, you have spoken about how the hierarchy, the Catholic hierarchy, did not support Oswaldo's efforts, and you've talked about the need for international support. What of yesterday or day before yesterday, Hope stating that he was friends with Raul Castro, that Cuba is a symbol and Cuba has a great history. What do you think meant when he said Cuba is a symbol? Thank you very much.
Let's together. Could you pass the?
Yeah, I'm Frank Olson. I have two things real quick. One relates to this last question. How have the priests and the change in Cuba in light of current developments there? And the other question simply is, what can be done to help the Cuban people today?
You want to go first, David, and then Rosemary, or vice versa?
I want Rosemary to
Okay,
go
Rosemary,
first
you
because
go
she
first.
addressed this yesterday on Facebook. I saw it. She made very moving comments.
Yes, and Christina, thank you for that question. I can only repeat what I saw. For the Cuban people, that is a people that suffer all sorts of persecution, not only religious persecution, also religious persecution. As my father used to say, this Christianization process implemented from day one against the Cuban people. The persecution of religions, by the way, not only against Christians. It is very sad. It is. It actually hurts a little bit to the omission of that people. When His Holiness was asked about a message for the Cuban people, His Holiness answered with a confession of a friendship with a murderous dictator, which is the most important representative of that have assassinated so many Cubans, including my father. There are Catholics in jail right now because they went out into the streets a year ago, and they were not a mention for them. And this is very dramatic because when the Pope talks, the Cuban people that is not intrinsically Catholic, but is suffering and is an oppressed people, they expect solidarity. And we, and when I say we, I consider myself also church, and a member of a church. I'm a member of a church. But I think I share this feeling with all the Catholics in and out the island. We hope compassion. We expect charity. And the world is listening to what the Pope said. And those declarations were very unfair with priests, with nuns, with Catholics in general, that are actually living that charity, accompanying the Cuban people in their quest for freedom. And we have seen expressions of what I'm mentioning here in many of those priests and Catholics from the island too during the last days. Frank, ¿cuál era la pregunta?
What can we do to help the Cuban people today?
Well, I think you could answer that question. I think that what David just did is very important. It's a very important step in helping the Cuban people because there is still a distortionate image, one that sadly His Holiness is also contributing to. There is a very distortionate image of the Cuban reality yet out there, especially in the American audience. There are propaganda of the Cuban region has had an impact also in this country. So it's very important now that I'm talking with all of you, help us raise the voices of the Cuban people. Those voices that were asking for change of the system, for freedom, for patria y vida a year ago, and that are still asking for the same things. Help us raise those voices, and also help us convince those in the position of taking action to take those actions in favor of those demands. We are still are still trying to convince the Biden administration to stop concessions to the Cuban regime. And they just implemented concessions that actually infuse commerce that help the Cuban regime. Help us make not just the administration, but the democracies of the world understand the opportunity that the Cuban people is providing with this massive movement toward freedom. Because it's not just freedom for the Cuban people, it's democracy, it's stability, it's security for the whole continent. We wouldn't be talking about the collapse of democracy in Venezuela now without the Cuban regime. We're talking about the destabilization wave that we are seeing and we have been seeing in Latin America without the Cuban regime. We wouldn't be talking about the massive campaign of fake news, copy and pasting Russia Today in all the foreign media controlled by the Cuban regime without the Cuban regime. So this is not only a petition for solidarity. This is a self-preservation step that I ask you all help us to take together.
Well said, Rosa Maria. So David, I want to turn to you to answer the question, but also to help close out our conversation with a little bit of what happened to Payá and his legacy from the Black Spring to July 11th. So feel free to answer these questions, but help bring us to a close with that.
Payá's struggle didn't end with the Varela Project. And, you know, those signatures that he still had by the nuns. And I wish the Pope had said something about that.
That's right.
The struggle went on. 14,384 signatures were again delivered the following year. Oswaldo didn't give up on the political prisoners. Many of them were very close to him. That most of them 7 years for having simply collected those signatures. And I think that Oswaldo had taken a step to challenge the legitimacy of a dictatorship that no one had done. Lots of people had stood up and say, gee, we don't like the lack of rights, or people giving speeches or press releases. What made Oswaldo different and really important in Cuban history is he acted on it. And I think that even at the time of his death, he was still acting on it. The day that he died, he was on his way to Santiago de Cuba to educate young activists, to train more people. He oftentimes wanted to make sure there'd be another generation who would hold these values. I think he held them till his last breath.
David, thank you. Let me just close with, again, you've heard a little taste in the conversation. This is a consequential piece of work. And so please go out, buy the book, read the book, share the book, spread this. It's consequential in part because of what Rosa Maria said. There's a distorted narrative. There's a difficult, often grotesque streak of hypocrisy out there. David's helped tell the truth about freedom and democracy in Cuba. And we're so pleased to be able to host this event today. We're so pleased with a consistent record of standing by the Cuban people, recognizing that no change comes in Cuba without the Cuban people in the lead. It's why that we've been committed to working across Latin America, across the transatlantic space, to build a sense of understanding and solidarity with the Cuban people. And it's why I do think, David, that this book is of itself a contribution. We're waiting for the Spanish version. We're waiting for this to spread, for people to be aware, to understand the story, which I think is going to be relevant still to the future prospects of a free Cuba. So thank you for the work that you've put into this. Thank you for sharing your father's story. We are honored to have your family with us, honored to be able to be a platform for the launch of this. Patria Vita, please join me in thanking our guests. Thank you so much.
Ana, del financiero Bloomberg. Usted y el presidente López Obrador tienen rasgos parecidos en las formas, tienen discursos muy bien elaborados y muy pausados también. Me gustaría saber, cuando uno está en la presidencia de un estado, de un país, cómo se pasa del mundo de las ideas y cómo esto se transforma en políticas reales. En México se está viendo pues un poco de dificultades a la hora de entender cómo el presidente López Obrador llevará a cabo esta